everybody, I'm JJ Johnson. You're watching Reality Survival. So right now what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk to you about some facts about EMPs and, maybe cover, it might help misconstrue some common myths that are out there. Spent the last couple of days doing some research, and because there's just a ton of bad information about the reality of EMPs and what happens. And I also have kind of what spurred this was I wanted to do some research on how to build a Faraday cage and to do it right so that it actually works, because I haven't seen any videos that I was able to find that actually show the right way to do Faraday cages. And it took a lot of research and a lot of looking around and all that kind of stuff, multiple hours of looking around. And so as I was doing research, I was basically pulling out little nuggets of information that I was like, oh, I didn't know that. That's, a very commonly misunderstood thing. So that's kind of what this whole video is going to be about, is basically to just talk a little bit about EMPs and generate discussion about them. Now, I will give you a caveat that I'm not an electrical engineer, nor do I know a lot about electronics and all that kind of stuff. So if I confuse some of these terms or something like that, or I get it wrong, I apologize. I do have some notes here that I've taken, as I was looking around on these sites. So I believe that this is accurate information, but it's possible that there could be some misinformation in here. And why is there so much misinformation on EMPs? Well, the last actual high altitude atmospheric tests, if I am not mistaken, were done in like 1980 or so with China, and before that it was France in 74. And so there hasn't been a lot of atmospheric testing done of nuclear weapons in a long time, and our electronics have significantly changed and become more sensitive, more digital, and all those kinds of things since then. And so a lot of stuff is speculation, even on the part of these researchers. And the testing that's done still is actual speculation, because they don't know what the actual yields are going to be exactly. And there's the weapons have changed to a certain degree. So bottom line is there is a lot of speculation, but there is a lot of stuff that we do know about how these things happen. So to start this off, I guess there was a study in 2008 by Meditech that found that the time required to obtain replacement for any one of the 370 or so largest transformers in the United States was going to be at least 3 years. You'll often hear that it's going to be a year or 2 years, but this study said it was going to be at least 3. Now, if it was a solar storm that caused the blackout, coronal mass ejection, or a massive solar storm or solar flare, then that could actually, if it's severe enough, it doesn't just affect the side that's facing towards the sun. That can actually affect the entire globe. And so that 3-year number would go up significantly, because you need electricity to be able to make the new transformers. So the 3-year figure assumes that that country that produces those would have a grid. Well, if it was a solar flare or a superstorm, solar superstorm kind of thing that caused it, they may not necessarily have electricity either. So that whole how long it'll take to get the grid back up could be very long in case of a super solar storm. Okay, but we're really trying to focus more on EMPs, but there is a little interchangeability over and talking about these, just so you kind of understand the differences between the two. Now, when it comes to an EMP, you got to understand that this is not an all or nothing game. Okay, the severity of an EMP attack can vary greatly. To get the maximum effect, then it has to be at a specific height above, basically the center of the country and that kind of thing, and it's going to cover so much. They call this area where it affects it the source area. Now, the source area is then, there's an area around that area called the tangent area, and the area in the tangent area is not as greatly affected and may be affected, not much at all. And so, certain parts of the country, if let's say one bomb went off over the center of the bomb, the coasts and certain parts of the north and south may not be affected very bad. Whereas if there were two bombs and let's say they were, kind of centered over the center of the kind of midway in the center of the country, then that would do even more damage and cover even more areas. But still in the north and south, there may be areas where the power doesn't go out. So just throw that out there because a lot of people talk about just one bomb taking out the whole country, and that's a very speculative thing. It's possible, but it also may not happen either. So when we talk about a nuclear EMP or a high altitude electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon, or an HEMP, it's really not just one pulse. It's actually 3 pulses. So you have the E1 effect, then the E2 effect, and the E3 effect. So let me just read a little bit here to you about each one of those effects so that you understand kind of from a technical standpoint what it is that each one of these pulses is doing. Okay, so nuclear EMP is actually an electromagnetic pulse. We know that. The EMP is usually described in terms of 3 components. The E1 pulse is a very fast pulse that can induce very high voltages in equipment along electrical wiring and cables. E1 is the component that destroys computers and communications equipment and is too fast for ordinary lightning or surge protectors. The E2 component of the pulse is the easiest to protect against and has similarities in strength and timing to electrical pulses produced by lightning. The E3 pulse is very different from E1 and E2. The E3 component of the pulse is very slow pulse, so slow that most people would not even use the word pulse to describe it. The E3 component lasts tens to hundreds of seconds and is caused by the nuclear detonation heaving the Earth's magnetic field out of the way, followed by the restoration of the magnetic field to its natural place. The E3 component has similarities to a geomagnetic solar storm, or a geomagnetic storm caused by a very severe solar storm. So let's look a little bit closer at the E1 now, because this is the one, the E1's really the one that causes a lot of the damages to the small personal electronics, radios, all that kind of stuff. That's the one we kind of worry about the most, although the E3 causes significant damage as well. The E1 component is produced when gamma radiation from nuclear detonation knocks electrons out of the atoms in the upper atmosphere. The electrons begin to travel generally in a downward direction at relativistic speeds, more than 90% of the speed of light. Okay, so they're cooking. In the absence of a magnetic field, this would produce a large pulse of electric current vertically in the upper atmosphere over the entire affected area. The Earth's magnetic field acts on these electrons to change the direction of the electron flow to a right angle to the geomagnetic field. So it's coming down, and as it's pushing out, that's what helps to cause this pulse. The interaction of the Earth's magnetic field and a downward electron flow produces a very large but brief electromagnetic pulse over the affected area. And this is also what's called the Compton current or the Compton effect. E2, according to the EMP Commission Executive Report in 2004, quote, in general, it would not be an issue for critical infrastructure systems since they have an existing protective measure for defense against occasional lightning strikes. But the most significant risk is synergistic because the E2 component follows a small fraction of a second after the first component's insult, which has the ability to impair or destroy many protective and control features. the energy associated with the second component thus may be allowed to pass into and damage the systems. So the first one comes along and it basically opens the floodgates, and the second one comes through and then does additional damage. So it's a pretty effective destruction of electronics. So the E3. The E3 component has similarities to a geomagnetic storm caused by a very severe solar flare. Like a geomagnetic storm, the E3 can produce geomagnetically induced currents in long electrical conductors, basically telephone lines, transmission lines, those kinds of things, which can then damage or destroy components such as power line transformers. So it basically hits all these lines and it shoots this voltage down into the transformers and then essentially can melt portions or parts of the transformers. Because of the similarity between solar-induced geomagnetic storms and the nuclear E3, it has been common to refer to solar-induced geomagnetic storms as a solar EMP. It should be noted, though, this is interesting, at ground level, however, a solar EMP, or a solar storm, is not known to produce E1 or E2 component effects. So, a solar storm or solar flare, even a significant one, is not going to knock out small electronics, and it's also not going to knock out your vehicles as well. That's a common misconception out there. Okay, so just going into some of the facts that I pulled out of here. Like I said, nobody knows exactly how and what electronics are going to be affected during an EMP. The general rule is on this that long lines, larger electronic devices, i.e. transformers and stuff like that, and sensitive digital electronics are going to be the most affected by an EMP. Okay. The next thing is that by disconnecting power, by pulling it from a power source, pulling whatever you want to protect from a power source, retracting the antenna and unplugging the power cords from the device, in combination with using an effective Faraday cage for shielding, does reduce the chances of having that item be affected. Notice I said reduce, okay, because this is not it's not easy to quantify exactly how much protection you need, but we'll talk about more about that when I talk about the Faraday cages. Okay, so using shielding, it may help to shield small electronics from the E1 and E2 effects of an EMP, but anything that's plugged into the grid is going to get hit by going to get hit because it doesn't have shielding, all that, and it's going to fry it. So anything that's out and open, it's very unlikely that it's going to be used, especially if it's plugged into the electrical grid. Okay. All right. So we already said this, a Faraday cage is not needed to protect against electronics against a solar storm at ground level. All right, that's a little repetitive, sorry about that. This I thought was very interesting. This is my 6th point here, is many vehicles will still actually run after an EMP. This is a common misconception, I think, and they there's been a lot of testing done on cars and the how much RF protection cars have and all that kind of stuff. Especially, so older vehicles especially are going to be the ones with less sensitive electronics. So you've heard probably people say that if it's like 79 or before, when it doesn't have electronic ignition, that's going to probably work okay. Well, that's true to a certain extent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But even cars up to 2000, 2003 or so are probably, there's going to be a pretty good percentage of those cars that are going to run afterwards. And even some actual current day cars may. And the reason for this is because cars don't have very long cabling, and that acts as antennas to gather more RF. and they also, the metal shell, the metal construction of it also provides some degree of protection as well. Now, and you'll notice that they're built with RF protection, because if you remember in older cars and stuff like that, they didn't have as good RF protection, and when you turn a radio on, you'd hear like the alternator whining and stuff. Well, nowadays they have built more RF protection into that around the ignition system and everything, so that the radios don't hear those and stuff. And so the thought is that some of these cars are going to run. Now, how much of them and all that kind of stuff, I don't know. They also may experience what's called, I think it's called electronic lockup, where essentially once the pulse comes through, they're going to die and they're not going to want to run, because the battery's going to need to be disconnected, then reconnected to free up that electronic lockup. So you know that there's definitely going to be issues, but some of the vehicles will probably work. That may not matter a whole lot, because if the grid goes down, then you're not going to be able to get gas for very long. So for short term, it might be okay, but unless you've got gas stored up at your location or whatever, it ain't going to make much of a difference. So just something to think about there. Okay. So yeah, I already talked about the solar storm being able to affect the entire globe if it's severe enough. So here's an interesting one too. Old vacuum tube radios are possibly going to be less affected by EMPs, and that's a pretty common thing that we hear about, right? You get the old tube stuff, it's going to be good to go. You won't have anything to worry about. So use the old stuff; it'll make them like they used to. But it's not exactly right. Though they are more resistant, most of these items do contain an early solid-state device called a selenium rectifier, which is very vulnerable to EMP. So if you have an old tube radio or something that you're planning on using, try to get a spare selenium rectifier. I don't even know what that is, but that's what I learned. So, okay, here's another one that is pretty common. An ammo can is not actually a very good Faraday cage without significant modifications and nesting, which I'll talk about when I talk about building a Faraday cage or a nested Faraday cage. Okay, and just a little bit on, I'll do a little bit on right now on the types of material that work best for Faraday cages. So copper is going to work best, aluminum is going to probably be after that, then galvanized steel, and then like a regular steel. And you want whatever it is to be an unpainted surface when you're doing that too. So just something to think about. The steel, like in an ammo can, is more effective on lower frequencies, but it's not nearly as effective on higher frequencies. So it's not that good. Okay. Okay, we're going to talk about a little bit, just real quick on this one, about backing up data. You know, a lot of people will take and they'll put stuff on flash drives and everything like that because they want to have their data, or they have it on like an Amazon Fire or, you know, an iPad or something like that. Unless that's going to be protected inside of a Faraday cage, those are not good items to store on because they're going to probably get fried. And what you should use instead is optical media. So a single layer, you don't want to use double-sided, but a single layer CD or DVD is not going to be affected by an EMP, but flash drives will be rendered useless unless they're, you know, protected. Okay, so the safest way that you can provide some degree of protection for your car is to, and it's a modest degree, but you know, if it's one of those cars that have a little bit better RF protection and you want to increase the chances that your car will work, or if you've got an older car too that you want to put in there, you want to park it inside of a very well grounded metal shed. So metal shed with basically grounding on each side of it, you know, deep earth grounding, is going to be the best. Going to give you the best possible chances. Now, here is my understanding about grounding. Okay, and this is one of the subjects that gets really contorted in a lot of different videos. But the smaller objects, like, you know, a 6 to 10 gallon galvanized pail or something like that you're going to make a Faraday cage out of or whatever, don't need to be grounded. And in fact, if you do ground them, it can actually cause more RF energy to be transferred into the object. Okay? The larger an object is, the more RF energy it's going to be hit with. And I want to say it's like 6.6 megawatts per square meter is what they figure that will approximately be coming from a nuclear weapon. So the larger the item is, then the more RF you have to deal with. So larger items like a shed, like a vehicle shed or something like that, you have to ground, because there's basically they're tracking too much, and it needs to be routed away so that it goes down into the ground. But smaller items that are built appropriately, the skin effect of the Faraday cage is enough to protect it. And to very briefly describe the skin effect, it is like, this is layman's terms here, because it's certainly more complicated than this, but the ions basically come down from the atmosphere and they hit the outside skin of the surface. They're positively charged. The ions on the inside are negatively charged, and they kind of counteract each other. That's not technically correct, but that's the easiest way that I can think of to explain it. But it essentially, I'm having a hard time thinking of the best way to explain this. It essentially just reduces the Faraday effect on the cage, just reduces the overall impact on the ability of the storm to impact the item. So we'll leave it at that. And I'll talk a little bit more about it and try to explain it a little bit better in the Faraday cage video as well. Okay, so that's protecting a car. Metal shed, grounded on all four sides. It's going to give you a little better chance. Still not perfect. So if you have a pre-electronic ignition era vehicle, so like the 79-ish or so or before, it's important that you also have electrical wiring diagram for the vehicle, because you're probably going to have to do some work on it, and plenty of fuses, and critical electrical spare parts. Here's the reason why. It's very easy for high voltages to punch through old and cracked wiring insulation. Although post-EMP repair of these older vehicles is going to be easier than a modern vehicle, it could still be very frustrating to deal with after an EMP. So essentially, I guess what they're trying to say here is that the cracks in the insulation and all that kind of stuff can cause problems, because that high voltage can go in there. It can still damage components. Even though they're not digital components, it can still damage the components to the point where they won't work. So think about that. Rewiring an old vehicle might be a good fix to that, having current good wiring. All right, I'm about to run out of battery, so I need to hurry here. Solar storms are not going to damage cars and trucks. EMPs will. But some of them will probably still run. A metal safe. I've seen some people talk about putting stuff in a metal safe and whatnot, and a metal safe is only going to offer some very small amount of protection from an EMP. It's not significant enough to protect items properly. Now, the last couple things I'll talk about here are solar panels. Many people who say they have an off-grid power system that are interconnected to the power grid so that they can sell their electricity back to the system. And that's all fine and good, but from an EMP and a solar storm standpoint, the interconnectedness to the grid is the worst possible scenario. It's going to fry it all. It's not going to do you any good. Additionally, a nuclear EMP, not a solar flare, but a nuclear EMP or solar storm, but a nuclear EMP also poses additional danger to solar power systems that are off-grid. A nuclear EMP can destroy all of the components of an unprotected solar power system, a standalone power system. This includes solar panels, and the solar charger and all those things. And, I mean, solar panels are basically just big semiconductors that are right there facing the sky. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this. The article that I was looking at on this particular topic did talk about taking like a mesh and putting a screen mesh around the panels and then grounding those. Since that's a big surface area over multiple panels, then you take basically a stainless or aluminum mesh and put it around the panels and then ground it, and that could offer some protection. But they said that's only, it may or may not work. They said the best thing to do really is just to store extra panels in extra parts in a protected manner, in a Faraday cage type manner. So anyway, guys, like I said, I mentioned a couple times, I'll do a follow-up video. I ordered everything that I need to do to build a nested Faraday cage to show you how to properly protect small electronics and all that kind of stuff. So that video will be coming out shortly. If I mess anything up, I apologize. You can tell me in the comments below how I got it wrong or whatever. This is all just information that I was able to gather over a couple of days of kind of looking into it and trying to understand, at least get a little bit of understanding of how everything works. So let me know in the comments below what you have done to build your Faraday cages. Do you have a Faraday cage for your stuff? If so, how did you construct it? I would really like to know how you guys constructed it, because I'd like to hear this before I actually do the video on the Faraday cage thing, because A, maybe I'll learn something from you, but B, I'd just like to see like all the different varying opinions on what works, So anyway, guys, as always, I definitely appreciate it when you click the thumbs up button, when you share it with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. And don't forget to live the 6 Ps. Proper prior preparation prevents poor performance. Stay safe, guys.